right, today we're going to be talking very briefly about C.S. Lewis's short chapter called The Three Parts of Morality. So this is a, as I say, short chapter from Lewis's work, Mere Christianity. I like this essay because it's clear and it's short, and it also functions as a kind of pivot point for our course. Up until now, we've been talking about morality and ethics as if it's just, one thing. But Lewis says there's really three different parts to morality. And I think that he's right about this, and I think it's a helpful way of thinking about what morality is and about what ethics is. Because, of course, ethics, most formally, is a philosophical study of morality. What Lewis says is, he says, when we think about morality, we tend to think about what he calls the first part of morality. And he says this is very natural, but it's not the only part of morality. So the first part of morality, he says, is like interpersonal morality, the rules that govern interpersonal behavior. So when we've been talking about the moral law, things like this throughout the course, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit murder, those kinds of things. That's the first part of morality. It's the part of morality that governs our relationships with other people, our interactions with other people. And basically, up until this point, that's all that we've been talking about in this course, as we've been talking about, what are the rules that govern interpersonal behavior? Are those rules real, or do we just make them up? And how do we know what they are? And how do we resolve conflicts between them? Yeah. So Mill is talking about, how do we know that stealing is wrong? How do we know that murder is wrong? Kant's talking roughly about the same kind of thing. Yeah. But now we're going to transition to talking about the second and ultimately at least touching the third part of morality. The second part of morality, Lewis says, is in-house morality, intrapersonal morality, which is to say not interpersonal morality, which is how you interact with other people, I-N-T-E-R, intrapersonal, N-T-I-N-T-R-A, personal, interpersonal. It's like governing yourself. So Lewis uses an analogy to kind of help you understand the difference between the first part of morality and the second part of morality and the third part of morality, where he talks about a fleet of ships sailing in formation. So you can imagine a fleet of ships. My goodness, you can imagine a fleet of ships. And he would say the first part of morality is like the rules are like, don't run into other ships, stuff like that. Don't steal, don't lie. That's like ships bumping into one another, right? And so we've been spending most of our time talking about that. It's like if you want the ships to, to be moving in formation and everything to be going well, they can't be running into one another, right? Pretty straightforward. But then he says it's also part of morality, not just that they don't run into one another. It's part of morality that each ship, the ships obviously represent people, that each ship take care of its own its own mechanics, right? Its own internal mechanisms. So, for example, he says it won't matter very much if the captains of the ship know that they shouldn't run into one another. He says if like the steering mechanisms of a ship is broken, it doesn't matter that they know that they shouldn't be running into another ship. If they can't turn and they can't slow down, it doesn't matter. They're going to run into other ships. Right? So he basically says it's one thing to know what the rules are to govern interpersonal behavior, but he's basically suggesting that if you are of such poor condition yourself in terms of your own morality, in terms of your own virtues, that's where we're going to be going, that it won't matter. If you don't have the virtue of honesty, it doesn't matter if you know up here that you shouldn't be lying to people, you're going to do it anyway, right? So virtue ethicists, which is where we're going to be going with this, the third major tradition in ethics, right? We've been talking about utilitarianism, we talked about deontology. The third major tradition in third major ethical theory is virtue ethics. It's actually the most popular, I believe, amongst professional philosophers these days. Virtue ethicists don't focus a ton on rules. That's not really what they focus on. What they focus on is the second part of morality, like how do people become the right kind of person, such that when they know what the right thing to do is, that they will actually do it and be able to do it. That's what virtue ethicists focus on, right? So virtue ethicists kind of generally have this kind of attitude that it's like, yeah, most people know, the rules. They know that they shouldn't steal or lie or murder. The problem with people isn't that they don't know these things. It's not like an intellectual problem. when they steal. That's not like an intellectual problem. The problem is that people are assholes, right? The problem is that people are jerks. Like, they know that cheating is wrong, and then they do it anyway because they're not the right kind of person to do what is right when they know that it's right. They will know that they shouldn't cheat, but then, like, their belly, as it were, their appetites will say, but this is easier. It's a shortcut if you just cheat. Then we can go back to watching Netflix. And it's like, and the person's like, well, I guess I'm going to cheat, right? So it's not a failure of knowledge. It's a problem of virtue, right? So first part of morality, interpersonal morality, don't run into the other ships. Second part of morality says you need to get your own house in order such that you become the kind of person that you do the right thing when you know what the right thing to do is. Yeah, that's actually very, very, very tricky. And the third part of morality, Lewis says, is using the ship analogy again, a fleet of ships sailing in formation. He says they have to not run into one another. They have to be of such a condition that they can avoid running into one another, basically. And then he says it also matters if you have a fleet of ships sailing in formation that they go to the right place, right? So if they're supposed to go to, New York from Europe and they end up going to South Africa instead, that's going to be a failure, even if none of them ran into one another. It's like they went to the wrong place. So he basically says the third part of morality is kind of like the purpose of life. It's like, why are we here? The meaning of life, questions like this, like what are we supposed to be doing here? And so the third part of morality ties ethics very concretely into these like bigger questions about what the universe is like and how we're supposed to live in it. Like, for example, is there a God or is there not a God? Like, that is going to be relevant when we're trying to figure out where we should be going. Because Christianity, for example, says that human beings are created by God for his own pleasure, and what he means to do with human beings is to make them infinitely happy. That's very, very different than other cultural religious traditions who think that the purpose of life, for example, might be to escape the cycle of reincarnation. That's a very, very different way of thinking about what life is about. And so Lewis would say that that's like the difference between sailing to New York City and sailing to South Africa, right? Both, Christians and Buddhists, for example, would agree that you shouldn't run into other ships. They would also agree that you need to take care of, become a virtuous person such that you don't accidentally run into other ships. Buddhists, Christians would agree about that. But they do disagree quite a bit about what the purpose of life is. So Lewis says about the first part of morality, interpersonal morality, thou shalt not steal, you should be nice to other people, these kinds of things. He says like everybody agrees about that. There's like virtually no disagreement about the first part of morality. He says disagreement starts with the second part of morality, talking about virtues. And then he says disagreements can become pretty intense actually about the third part of morality, which is interesting, right? So the first part of morality, everybody basically agrees. The second part, you start to get disagreement. In the third part, you can get pretty, very substantial disagreement between people, depending on their metaphysics, depending on what kinds of things they think are real. Like, is there a God? Is there not a God? Do we have souls? What is life ultimately about? What are we supposed to be? What are we supposed to be aiming for as individuals and as a species, basically? All right, so we've been talking about the first part of morality. We talked, Mill, we talked Kant, we talked Rawls. And then we, counterpoint with Nietzsche, who basically thinks that everybody else is wrong. And then we are now making a pivot point to talking about the second part of morality. When we talk about Aristotle is going to be our representative, or he is going to be the person that we read from the virtue ethics tradition. And then we're going to talk a little bit about St. Thomas Aquinas and go back to C.S. Lewis at the very end of the course. And St. Thomas Aquinas is drawing from Aristotle, so he also has a lot to say about things like virtue, but he also starts to connect the first and second part of morality to the third part of morality more explicitly, where he thinks that what is right and wrong, the kind of person that we're supposed to be, is all kind of shaped by our relationship to God, right? Because he is a Christian. So he says that Aristotle had a lot right, but his account of ethics is incomplete because he doesn't know what life is ultimately about, which is to be unified with the divine, right? To be unified with God, right? Because Aristotle, pre-Christian, pagan is the language that they would use, didn't know about the Christian God. And then when we come back to C.S. Lewis, we're going to highlight this third part of morality, that different cultures and different religions really do have very sharply different views about what the purpose of life is. Yeah, this kind of third part of morality. All right, so that's it. I hope that you enjoy learning about Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas and C.S. Lewis. Thank you very much. That's it for today.